Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Emily Harle. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be joined by two guests to hear about the problems facing charities with their banking services and what's being done to solve them.
But first, we're joined by our reporter Dami Adewale to talk about a recent long read he's written. Dami, what have you been looking into?
Hi Lucinda and Emily, thanks for having me on. In light of the violent disorder and riots fueled by the far right, I wrote a piece analysing this situation and how charities could respond. So I was speaking to sector experts about the issues at hand, and we covered how social media misinformation and political messaging contributed to the disorder. We also spoke about how charities have reacted internally in terms of supporting their staff and externally for their communities as well. And we also looked at ways that the sector can address the discrimination that we've been seeing.
So what struck you as the most interesting piece from your research interviews?
So my main takeaway was that obviously the riots didn't come out of nowhere, and it's been pretty much the tip of the iceberg with underlying issues building up over the years, and much more work needs to be done to stop situations like this from occurring. I also had a chat with Enver Solomon, the chief executive of the Refugee Council, and he brought up that the violent protests in Liverpool towards a hotel housing refugees happened just last year in January, so it's been an ongoing issue there. The main thing for me was how fleeting and seemingly innocuous social media posts or messages can kind of blow up and have a seriously negative impact, leading to much worse situations. And obviously there's a focus on the use of specific words and phrases as a catalyst, which was also interesting, but I think we'll come on to that soon.
Yeah, I think for me, reading your piece, the big thing that I took away from it was the need for community level support to tackle this problem in the long term, because although it came and fortunately the violence only lasted a week or so, it's not gone away. The problems haven't gone away. These issues are still very much there, and like Liverpool last year, they're inevitably going to flare up again unless they're addressed adequately. So you spoke to the chief executive of Locality. What did he have to say about the need for more community level support to tackle this problem?
Yeah, so I did have a chat with Tony Armstrong, who's always helpful. And Tony spoke about how a clear message of support from central government would help the sector greatly, and how simple things like positive messaging can go a long way in terms of creating a better relationship between charities and the government. So a lot of Locality's members are charities with a great level of knowledge about the communities that they serve. So working more closely with them can help the government in the long run, especially in the face of the local authority cuts that we've been seeing. Locality is obviously campaigning for sustainable funding settlements from local authorities and central government to ensure community groups and charities remain supported, as they're so pivotal to local well-being.
So we saw so many counter-protesters showing up, standing against racism, standing against hatred, standing against the far right. And that was really heartening. But at the same time, we've got to remember that this doesn't necessarily go away. So we need to think about, within the charity sector, what can we do to make sure that we are really focusing on that anti-racism piece. One of the interesting things that came out of your discussion with Enver Solomon was the importance of making sure that leadership within the sector is diverse and inclusive. And that was also something that was highlighted by an open letter earlier last week. So there was an open letter that a group of more than 25 people with lived experience of migration systems drafted and sent to 150 charity leaders and funders, and they were calling for action in the wake of the riots. These people have lived experience of migration, but also most of them work for UK charities. And the letter, it's asking for robust safety measures for staff, such as flexible working, but it also pushes for racial justice to be embedded in all aspects of charities' work, including through leadership development opportunities for people with lived experience of the migration sector. And of course, anti-racism strategies are something that a lot of charities have been working on for some time now, but it's very clear that more still needs to be done.
Absolutely. And that was something that we covered last week in our podcast discussion with Zoe, Amma and Ange Handa, talking about how charity leaders can support the response to the riots internally. And another interesting point from your piece, Dami, was around the use of language. And that was something that you covered particularly with Enver from the Refugee Council, right?
Yeah, that's right. I had a really insightful discussion with Enver, and we spoke about how much language matters when referring to minoritized communities. So obviously Enver's main point there was about using language as a way of recognizing the importance of people from all backgrounds in a positive way, and not framing individuals with terms like illegals, which can shift the narrative and lead to refugees being viewed more negatively. And building on from that, the British Red Cross also posted the thread on X about the importance of language, highlighting how terms like asylum seeker and refugee, which pretty much should be neutral terms, have been sort of hijacked and their meanings subverted in a negative fashion.
I would encourage anybody listening to read your piece, which is available under the features tab on the Third Sector website. And it's also an issue which we will be continuing to cover on the podcast in the coming weeks. Dami, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Moving on to this week's main feature. Have you ever experienced challenges with your charity's banking arrangements? If you have, you're certainly not alone. The Charity Commission found that almost half of trustees consulted in a survey earlier this year said their charity had experienced poor service from their banks in the past year. Another study found that charities with incomes of less than £100,000 a year were more likely to have experienced banking issues, with problems ranging from opening accounts to having services suspended or their accounts frozen without warning.
We have two guests joining us for the discussion today. First up is Mike Conroy, Director of Commercial Finance at UK Finance, a banking trade association which released a digital guide last month to help charities open and manage bank accounts that meet their needs. Hello, Mike.
Morning.
Also joining us is Clare Mills, the Deputy Chief Executive of the Charity Finance Group, which has collaborated with UK Finance in the development of its guide. Hello, Clare.
Morning, hello.
Thank you both very much for joining us today. I'd like to start off by hearing a first-hand account from a small charity chief executive. Kat Ross is the chief exec of Baby Basics, and she's also a volunteer director at another small charity called Rwanda Child. She has experience with two banks, NatWest and the Cooperative Bank, and we'll start by hearing her views on NatWest.
So we were initially set up as a community account, which NatWest used to do. And then they got rid of that and moved everybody to a business account, which was fair enough. That's the way they were moving their business in the bank forward. But it means when you phone them, you're phoning through to a business banking team. And so you're speaking to people who don't understand that you are not an LTD. So your forms are different. You don't hold the same documentation that a business would hold. That can be frustrating, and you just feel like you're constantly having to educate the person on the end of the phone about, well, this is how charities run, and no, we don't hold that, we hold this instead. The pros are that they have so much more is digital, which makes it so much easier, but I find their customer service really, really rubbish. They're just not as personable and just don't have the same understanding of the charity sector that I think Cooperative does.
So that was Kat's experience of NatWest with Rwanda Child. And then Baby Basics, which is the other charity she works for, has banked with the Cooperative for the past 10 years. And let's hear her thoughts on that service in contrast.
I think for Cooperative Bank, the biggest thing is their ethics and also their customer service. That when you go into the bank, when you speak to people on the phone, they are super, super helpful and they understand the charity sector. But it's slightly behind the times in terms of its digital platforms, in terms of what you can do online and what still has to be done by post, which then slows everything down. So changing a mandate on a signatory on the account, we have to do by post. Ordering a new debit card for a staff member, we have to do by post. That always takes time. We've had instances when things have been lost in the post coming back to us, and then we've had to reapply again. I just find it really infuriating that we have a Cooperative branch in the city where we are based, and I can go and pay money into that branch, but I can't do any of the other work in the branch. It all has to be done by post. So it's a real hard balance between the two, I think, to get the ethics right but get the big bank digital presence. It's trying to find that middle ground, I think, would be the best type of bank.
So quite an interesting perspective there of the pros and cons of two different high street banks. The pros of the cooperative bank being the excellent customer service and the apparent understanding of the charity sector and how it works, whereas NatWest much better from a digital side of things, but customer service and its applicability to charities not so much. Claire, what did you make of that? Do you think Kat's perspective is usual?
I think Kat sounds quite unusual in that she's got experience of two different banks, and I'm not going to comment on which bank is better than the other. I think that would be unfair. One of the surveys that we've run recently has had comments back about just about every bank you could think about in terms of who they're going to for their charity bank accounts, which are working well and which could be improved. So I think that experience is unusual in having two accounts, but not unusual in the variation in service. What it really tells me is about the compatibility of banking and charity structures. And it really seems quite evident there that there's no one size fits all answer to charity banking because of the sheer breadth and variety within our sector. The charity sector is numerous organisations, and we are united by our purpose. It's to change the world for the better. So there isn't one type of governance or legal structure that quantifies a charity. There are so many different ones. And that variety means a big headache for the banks, I think. We're a very organic sector. There's lots of different ways that we can be arranged for our governance and for our compliance. And trying to understand that can be hard enough sometimes for people who work in the charity sector. When it comes to banking, banks have very clear structures. Their role in compliance is about making things straightforward and making things fit into boxes. And because of the number of different shapes we've got in the charity sector, they're not all squares or cubes. We could have hexagons, every shape there is out there. And that's that real clash, I think, between the desire to keep everything tidy and the kind of organic messiness of the charity sector. And we know that many of the banks are trying, they really want to do the right thing, but they come up against this challenge of understanding organisations that are so diverse, so varied, so different in how they're set up. The one thing that unites us is we do want to change the world.
So let's delve into those differences a little bit. Mike, how do you think charities differ from other clients? What makes them more complicated customers?
Well, I probably want to start by expressing some disappointment with some of the comments that were made. But as Claire knows, we do hear these sort of points from time to time for exactly the reasons that Claire sort of outlined. I mean, to provide a little bit of context, banks do have to comply with various financial crime and related regulations, such as those relating to anti-money laundering, the proceeds of crime, terrorism, and sanctions. And there are sort of two main differences that affect account opening and day-to-day management. So with personal customers, as I think everyone knows, there's only one person to identify and there's no complications with the legal entity. So as Claire was outlining, the charitable sector can come in very many different shapes, forms and sizes, which of course is not the same as it would be with personal customers. And with business customers, many are sole traders, so they're very like personal customers, or they can be limited companies. But limited companies will tend to only have one or two directors. And again, their legal structure is generally fairly straightforward. And of course, some charities, on the other hand, will have multiple trustees. I've come across one case where the charity in question had over 60, and obviously that's an extreme example, but there's usually many more people involved with the charity in terms of either trustees or people helping to run the charity than is the case with the business sector. And as Claire's outlined, they can have different structures. Some are registered, some are not registered. Some may choose to incorporate, some don't. And of course, we have a situation whereby, even in terms of regulation, we've got different regulators for England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it's unfortunate, but it does lead to, I suppose, lack of familiarity with some of the people in banks, when they come across, a particular situation that a charity has. And, they hear from very straightforward queries from companies and personal customers all the time. What they can be faced with in the charitable sector can be that little bit different. And of course, even if you're dealing with charities regularly, because they all come in different shapes and sizes, you may come across a situation that you're not very familiar with.
And this is not something new. Charities have been in existence for obviously an awfully long time. And Claire, indeed, you came on this very podcast just over 2 years ago to talk about the challenges facing this apparent disconnect between charities and the banking services that they are after. Has a lot changed in that time? Has progress been made? I know that you are in the process of finalising a survey looking into challenges.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. Thanks for that throwback. And it's just interesting to remember how long I've been personally thinking about this issue. I think I'm up to my 4th year now of looking at charity banking and how that's difficult for the sector and how we can make life better. I think some things have changed, actually. I think some of the relationship building we've been doing between charity infrastructure organisations and the banks and UK finance has definitely had a good opportunity to work together and understand each other a fair bit more. Some of the things we've done, CFG and HSBC together put out a modern banking guide a while ago. And of course, UK Finance have led the work with a number of charity infrastructure bodies contributing on the digital resource for banking for charities. So that's on the plus side, that's in one side of the scales. On the other side, what hasn't really changed? I think one thing that charities, whoever we talk to, what they would really like is a bit more simplification. Let's have some straightforward questions that we can understand. Don't ask us about our share capital. Don't ask us about our directors. Don't ask us about our turnover. Ask us questions that actually resonate and actually speak our language. So ask us about our income and expenditure rather than profit and loss. Ask us about our trustees rather than our directors. This is a tricky one. I'm going to say communication and customer service continues to be a massive challenge. I'm going to say that with a caveat in that you very rarely hear people talking or come across a survey where people are saying how good they have found customer service. We're maybe not getting a full picture when we do a survey on the scale of customer service, but it is a theme that comes up time and time again. Our latest survey is a rerun of a survey we did 2 years ago. We're now crunching the numbers and putting together the report that's going to be coming out in the autumn. And that communication piece is still very much in there. Charities struggling to understand what the banks are asking them, struggling to supply the right information, being asked questions that make no sense, or simply that communication falling down, whether it's trying to change an address, trying to change signatories, all those things being really difficult. The one thing that's really risen, I think, since last time we spoke is the awareness there is now of the risk of debanking, of a charity suddenly finding that its bank account has been closed or being at risk of that. And we're seeing that particularly with charities that are working overseas or trying to transfer money to and from different jurisdictions. That is a big concern. And at a time when we're seeing an awful lot of conflict around the world and people are moved to help people in other parts of the world who are in really dire situations, who are really absolutely in need, people in this country want to help. They want to do the right thing. They want to be compliant with anti-money laundering, anti-terror legislation, but it can be really difficult for those organisations to get money to where it needs to be.
And that debanking element is something we've seen a lot in our reporting as well. I mean, there's been sort of countless stories that I've covered personally of charities, losing access to their bank account and going, where do I go from here? You mentioned that there is also this disconnect between charities and banks in relation to what banks are asking charities to do, and charities sort of not necessarily understanding those asks or those protocols. And I was wondering, Mike, if you'd be able to come in here. Can you just talk a little bit about the common misconceptions that charities might have about banking?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with what Claire was saying about some of the communication challenges, and it goes back to the point I was making earlier that number of officials within banks will be asking questions which are often quite scripted, but they'll sometimes are more suited to personal customers or business customers, and than they are to charities. And there is this sort of difference in language. So to give you an example, banks may ask questions about beneficial owner, which is a term you often come across with sort of anti-money laundering regulations. And as you can imagine, many charities, if posed with that question, will say, well, the beneficial owners are the homeless, or someone else who the charity has been set up to help. And as a result of that, it's because sometimes people running charities haven't got a good understanding of why the bank's asking these questions. And I think this is what can lead to some misconceptions, because the banks are really trying to meet their sort of financial crime obligations, but there's sometimes a perception that the questions are unreasonable. And I think it's possibly not a question of the unreasonableness, but it's the way the question is framed, which was Claire's point. You've got to find a way of asking the same question, but trying to make it relevant and appropriate to people who are operating charities. And then, of course, they'll be obviously very willing to give you the answer, but you've got to perhaps frame it in the right way. We have come across examples where there's sometimes a perception that anti-money laundering regulations shouldn't apply to charities, or perhaps should be less stringent. And of course, the regulations themselves don't allow for that distinction. There's a couple of other areas which are more on the operational side. I think in Claire's historical surveys, you would have seen issues about internet banking, because some years ago, internet banking, because again it was designed primarily for personal customers and some business customers, it didn't have the capability to provide dual authorization. And that's something that's been addressed in recent times. But I think there is still a perception that people can't use internet banking because it won't allow for two people or more to authorize. And I think the industries have taken that on board and made those sort of changes. A couple of other areas is sometimes a view that charity banking is free. It is with many banks, but not all. And there are, increasingly, charitable services are paid for. And I think that goes back to the point made earlier in the on the podcast, which reference was made to a more vanilla service, by one particular organisation, and perhaps a different service by another. But I think in these cases, you'll find that some organisations and banks that specialise in the charitable sector, but there tends to be a charge applied, if you want to access that more bespoke service. And I suppose the other is that banks don't offer specific charitable accounts, and I think that's can be the case. There will be some banks that are providing accounts for charities, but they will call them business accounts. So that's another area where perhaps it's not as well understood as it might.
Thank you. And on that understanding element, this guide that UK Finance has developed and released is to help charities to better understand the banking ecosystem and help identify the service that is the best for them. I understand that you're also working on the other side to educate banks on how to meet the needs of charity clients and to understand them better. How are you going to ensure uptake of this guidance on both sides and make sure that it's a worthwhile initiative that leads to tangible impact?
Well, the thing about the guide is it was very much a collaborative endeavour with input from the charity commissioners, and very importantly, a range of charity organisation representatives, and their input was extremely valuable. And now the site's launched, links are being made available on bank websites. So if you go onto various bank websites, you can see links to the guides. The charity commissioners have also provided links. So I think there's a fair number of places in which the information can be found, which is good, and we're very welcoming of the support that we've had for it. Also, on the banking side, of course, the banks that have been part of this particular project, have been keen to use it internally, and of course, we will seek to adapt it and make changes, depending on the feedback that we get. So this is very much the start of a journey, and not its end.
And Claire, from your perspective, how are these cross-sector collaborative efforts going?
It hasn't always been plain sailing, but I think we've all reached a point now where we understand each other a lot better, and that's got to be a positive thing. And I see this, as Mike said, this isn't just to help the charity sector understand banking. Communications is a two-way thing, and it's very much as well a tool for bank staff. By building understanding on both sides, you can really then improve the communication that you're having and iron out some of these difficulties that charities are having when they're dealing with the banks. But equally, on the bank side, banks don't want to have difficult, lengthy customer service challenges. They want to offer the smoothest possible service to their customers for at least two reasons. Firstly, because reputationally, it's fantastic. If nobody's complaining and everybody's saying they had a wonderful service from you, that's worth gold. But secondly, in terms of real gold, because it costs you money to have staff dealing with long, complicated customer service issues. So it's a win-win if we improve this communication across the piece.
And Mike, I'd be interested to hear how you think regulators could play a role in this. The survey that I mentioned earlier, conducted by the Charity Commission, found that charity trustees want the Commission to be prioritising this issue and working with the Financial Conduct Authority to, in their words, make sure that banks are behaving more responsibly in their interactions with charities. But on a more general level, how do you think that the FCA and the Charity Commission could potentially work together better to improve banking services?
Well, I think they need to work closely, both the industry and the charitable sector, to understand what works well and where there's need for improvement. And I think they're doing that. I think the fact that they joined the work that we were doing and we, continue to have dialogue with themselves and the FCA is very encouraging. So it is already happening. I think the other sort of lens which regulators and industry and charitable organisations can look through is the new consumer duty standards, and these apply to charities, and they set a very high expectation in terms of the standard of care that firms have to give customers. And I think banks have been doing that. Obviously, the regulations are quite new, but they are now in force. And I think increasingly they're looking at these sort of customer service issues through this consumer duty lens to ensure that they give good outcomes for all customers, including obviously those running charities.
And I wanted to return to something that we mentioned earlier as well, that piece around the digital age and online banking. A lot of the charities that I've spoken with who've had these banking issues, it has been due to those administrative back and forths. And so I'm curious, do you think that online banking is being utilised as effectively as it could be when it comes to charities' accounts? And if not, how can that be improved? So Claire, I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
So thinking about the data we've just captured through the recent charity sector banking survey, what we found were 2/3 of people were telling us they preferred to use digital banking, and about the same amount were actually using it. So we are seeing that big shift, and that's certainly moved since we ran this survey 2 years ago. I don't know if that's because we have just all become more digital because we've had to, or because people have become more familiar with it and so less hesitant to give it a try. And the main reasons people were still wanting to use in-person banking was to do with paying in cash and checks or getting cash out. It wasn't really to do with the day-to-day transactions. I think one of the things about digital banking is we've already mentioned dual authorization for payments on accounts. And that was something that in our previous survey, people really wanted that to be available to them. When you used to write a check for things you paid, the treasurer would write the check, they'd fill it in, they'd sign it, they'd give it to somebody else to countersign. So you had that layer of security against fraud. And we weren't seeing that with digital banking when it first started to come in. But now we know a number of banks are offering that dual authorization for payments, and that is a huge step forward. I think some of the places where we're still seeing hesitancy over using digital banking might be down to the fact that people just don't know those services have evolved and that is now available to them.
As a final question to you both, acknowledging that we are not in a perfect system, hopefully it is moving in the right direction and there have been notable improvements since your last survey 2 years ago. But how can charities operating in the current banking environment avoid the most common pitfalls and get the best services they need? Mike, perhaps if I could start with you.
Well, of course, as you would expect me to say, I think making use of the guide is obviously a good place to start. But other than that, probably about planning ahead. If you need to make mandate changes, it's best to get ahead of those because, we know that's one of the more common issues that charities face when dealing with the bank. And if you leave the changes to the last minute, you can come across situations where perhaps, one or two or even more signatories have left and you've relied on the few that are left and then you run out of signatories on a mandate. Do alert the bank to any material changes in the way the account operates. And the reason for that is, it's important to be mindful of situations that might put a bank on alert and may need to sort of contact you. So if you're going to, perhaps your charity's never made payments, overseas, but perhaps, due to global circumstances, there's a need to do so. Probably helpful to, alert your bank to that and say that, well, we will be making a large payment to a certain jurisdiction, and then at least, you've called them before they call you. And the same thing would apply to, paying in any large sums, particularly large sums of cash. Obviously, if the bank does contact you about recent transactions or account behaviours, do engage in the process. It may seem very frustrating and something of a distraction, but, there are reasons why they're asking.
Claire, what would your top tips be?
So I wouldn't start by thinking about your bank. I would start by thinking about your organisation. What do you need? What do you really need from your financial service provider here? So really interrogate your needs. What are you going to be paying in? Are you going to be paying in cash, checks, or is all your money coming in electronically? How do you need to get hold of your money to distribute it, whether that's to your beneficiaries or to pay for your essential goods and services that you need to run your charities? That gives you a lot more information and a lot of useful questions to ask banks when you're looking at who can best give you the service that you need. Research the providers and think about what matters to you, whether that's you want access to BACS and tier 1 banks, you need a local branch maybe, you want dual authorization on your digital account, or the ethics of the bank matter to you. So have a think about all that. And if you're a larger charity, can you have a relationship manager? Can you have a named person who you will talk to about your banking needs? The third thing I would say, particularly if you're transferring money to and from overseas at the moment, think about whether you need an account with more than one institution. If you were to be debanked, they will send you a check with the balance of your funds. If you don't have another bank account, what on earth are you going to do with that check? So if that's a risk for you, be very aware of it and plan some, put some mitigation in place. Try and manage that risk. And as Mike said, over communicate. Tell banks what you're doing, tell them what you plan to do, tell them when you're going to do it, tell them when you've done it. Ask questions. What do I need to do if we're going to do this? What do you need to know to keep this account working effectively? Read the terms and conditions and good luck, really. I think on that final point, though, things will go wrong. So don't be afraid to use your bank's complaints procedure. And if that doesn't work out, to go to the financial ombudsman.
Claire and Mike, thank you both very much for talking to us today and for providing such great guidance.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We hope you found this discussion about banking useful. And if any of this rings true for you, or you'd like to offer an alternative perspective on the banking situation for charities, please do get in touch and we might just run a follow-on episode. You can contact us via our short survey or email me directly. Details of both are in the show notes to this episode. Next week, we'll be joined by Gemma Peters, Chief Executive of Macmillan, to hear about the charity's year of transformation. But for now, thank you to our guests Claire and Mike. Our producer is Nav Pal.